We'll be talking with Gary Webb for the next hour and also discussing his latest book called Dark Alliances. But first, Garden Grove, California, on our liberal line. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
What are you reading today?
The LA Times.
And do you have a copy of it in front of you? Is it? I know it's early.
No, it's in the other room. But I'm calling in regarding the upcoming testimony in the Clinton-Lewinski matter. And I don't know, I mean, I've seen the tenor of the news sort of change in the last couple of days, and suddenly people are talking about, oh, this is getting real serious, and et cetera, et cetera. And the president hasn't changed his stance. And I think, you know, it's turning into a big showdown, and Clinton is heading right into it. I think the pressure is really starting to come down on Starr now. I mean, if Clinton really didn't have a relationship with this woman, I mean, it's going to be just a tremendous in-your-face political victory for Clinton. I mean, it's going to put this entire political charade on the center showcase. And even if he did, it should be a pretty simple thing for him to defuse. And after all everything that we saw, starting with Quayle and then Rush Limbaugh and all the tremendous political attacks and everything, it just cracks me up that here we are in 1998, and the biggest feather in the Republican cap is this little sex scandal that they have going with Clinton.
Thanks, caller. We'll get another view from Little Rock, Arkansas, on our conservative line, reading the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. Good morning.
Good morning. I love C-SPAN, sir. This morning in our paper, we have an editorial by Meredith Oakley where she samples some of the opinions from different states concerning Hillary Clinton's statement that Clinton's troubles, the president's troubles, is because of an anti-Arkansas bias. I am so steamed today that she would say that about our state. I mean, it just appears to me that, you know, that they're unraveling up there about how to treat this problem with his not telling the truth to the American people. It has nothing to do with an anti-Arkansas bias. It has to do, I think, with the failure to just come out and level with the American people. I'd like to ask your guest what he thinks about it.
And let me also point out, Jill Lawrence has a piece this morning, the headline in USA Today, Hillary Clinton, public fighter, private mystery.
Well, I think the most significant story in the last couple of days has been the admission by the Starr people that their final report may have absolutely nothing to do with Whitewater. To me, that was the idea behind this whole special prosecutor argument, was that we were going to get into Whitewater and find out what went down there. And now it's going to be limited to Monica Lewinski, which tells me that there was nothing behind Whitewater if he's got nothing to bring forward to Congress, to bring forward to courts. And I think it's sort of a sad comment that we spent all this money and all this time, and all we've got is, like the caller said, a tawdry little sex scandal. I just don't think the American public's all that interested in what the president does with his private life. I'm sorry. I mean, I know it's on the front page of all the newspapers, but I don't sense from talking to people that they give a damn one way or another.
USA Today says the public is ready for the truth. Here's how the story begins. Americans want President Clinton to tell the truth when he testifies Monday to a grand jury, even if it means admitting that he had a sexual relationship with Monica Lewinski. The poll suggests trouble for Clinton if he commits perjury Monday. If that can be proven, 3/5 of those surveyed by USA Today said it would be serious enough for them to consider him removing from office. We got a call from Fort Lauderdale. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, and thank you for taking my call. I just wanted to talk about the Swiss banking settlement, and I think that's great that they finally owed up to their mistakes, but I'd like to see our politicians put pressure on the Swiss banks to quit being the bankers for the international terrorist and drug dealers. Supposedly this guy that blew up the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania is some billionaire from Saudi Arabia. I wonder where that guy keeps his money, probably in the Cayman Islands or Swiss or the whole host of these other banks. And I wish there was some pressure on to clean up the banking system, and all these terrorists and drug dealers wouldn't have any place to put their money.
There's a story on the front page below the fold in the Washington edition of the LA Times that profiles the Saudi dissident who you referred to, Hossami bin Laden. He is, his father had 52 children from a number of different wives. He is worth several $100 million, according to Robin Wright, who wrote the piece for the LA Times. And she profiles how he turned against the Americans essentially as a result of Operation Desert Storm in 1990.
Well, you know, there was a very interesting book written a couple of years ago by a journalist named Jonathan Whitney. It was called Endless Enemies. And his theory was that the United States foreign policy simply creates enemies wherever we go. And I think this is another example. When we intervene in the affairs of other countries and we shoot at people and people get shot at with American bullets and American weapons, we create enemies. And if this is true, that this man turned against the United States government as a result of Desert Storm, we've created another enemy there we might not have had before.
Two things related to this. An editorial cartoon in the Washington Times has a caricature of President Clinton. Hello, Saddam. What you doing this Sunday? And the headline in front of him, President to testify on Monday. What do you make of that? What's your reaction?
Well, it's the old wag the dog story. You know, you get in trouble, you start a war. And that's the way I read that cartoon.
And the New York Times editorial this morning, Saddam Hussein makes his move. The editors of the paper say two international inspectors who know the most about Iraq's efforts to create new weapons of mass destruction have raised an alarm that President Clinton and other world leaders must not ignore. The editorial concludes that he, the president, must not let these and other matters prevent him from dealing firmly with a crisis in Iraq that grows more dangerous by the day.
Yeah, and there was another story you were going to talk about a little later along those similar lines about the problems in Russia that are sort of being diverted and swept under the rug while we concentrate on whether or not oral sex is sex. I think it's an excellent point.
Michael McFaul, who is a fellow at the Hoover Institution and also a professor at Stanford, has a piece this morning. It's called Perspective on Russia. It's on the op-ed page of the LA Times. The headline is, "Forget about Monica, it's Moscow, and the stakes are global." Let me just read you 2 or 3 sentences from the piece. He writes, quote, "By this time, Russia very well may be down the throes of a major market meltdown, which in turn might trigger political upheaval on a scale similar to Indonesia. Different from Indonesia, however, Russia still has 10,000 nuclear weapons. The gravity of Russia's crisis makes this September summit one of the most important foreign policy missions of the Clinton presidency and an event of much greater importance than his grand jury testimony." By the way, there's a story on the front page of most newspapers about the financial situation and Boris Yeltsin, who as of now is saying that he is not going to devalue the ruble. Michael McPhail concludes this morning in the LA Times by saying, "No one has greater interest in promoting the consolidation of democracy and capitalism in Russia than Bill Clinton. If Russia eventually succeeds in becoming a member of the international community of democratic states, President Clinton will secure his place in history as an important foreign policy president."
Yeah, and that's the point I made earlier. There are a lot more important things going on around the world that we're reading nothing about because the news media is consumed with this Monica story.
And this is Michael Wine's piece. Just a quick headline. Stock and bond prices drop in Russia as investors bolt. Stock and bond prices plunged today, jarring Russia's hopes that the government could avert a depletion of its finances and a meltdown of Russia's banking system. An email from John Andraco. "I am appalled that you would have Gary Webb on your program. There he sits mouthing anti-government garbage about how Tailwind was stopped and how the question is still open as to what happened. He has no business on a credible program with his bias against the government. He must be a product of his times and a typical California nut. There have been too many investigations into the drug charges to have his idea promoted as truth. The moderator sat there, referring to me, and questioned him as though he believed this nonsense about Tailwind. Unbelievable for C-SPAN."
Well, I think as a reporter, you've got to have some sort of an anti-government look at it to cover them fairly. If you're pro-government, who needs you? My view is that when you're a reporter, you're supposed to be reporting things the government doesn't want you to report, not the things the government wants you to report. They have millions of people on the payroll who are happy to tell you all the great things that our government is doing for us, and that's fine, but it's not the press's job to be cheerleaders for the government.
Gary Webb with us for another 10 minutes or so, and then later we'll take you to Detroit, where the C-SPAN school buses parked, and talk to a couple of reporters from the 2 newspapers in that town. Long Island, New York, good morning on our moderate line.
Good morning. Am I on?
You sure are.
You know, I just heard this gentleman say that a reporter could be you're either anti or pro-government. I don't think you should be either. I think that what you should do is examine that statement, sir.
Well, in fairness to him, I don't think that's what he said, but stay on the line. We'll get you equal time. Do you want to rephrase exactly what you said?
What I meant is you shouldn't have a bias, but you should not be afraid of being anti-government, of being labeled anti-government. You know, when you're an investigative reporter, you're out to uncover wrongdoing, essentially. And if you go into the job believing that everything the government tells you is true, you're not going to be very good at what you do. And unfortunately, a lot of reporters these days are not reporters as much as they are stenographers. And they go to the government, they write down what the government tells them, and then they go back and put it into the paper without really examining it. So to be accused of being anti-government, I don't think is all that much of an epithet, frankly.
Am I on still?
You sure are.
Oh.
I told you I'd give you equal time.
I've been around a long time. I'm 73 years old, and I've done my stint in German prison camps and things like that. I've seen what the press and what certain people tried to say never happened, the Holocaust. I walked right past it myself, Mr. Eisenhower did. I can see what the press can do. I can see how the press can take a statement and blow it up. I can see how they're turning around now and trying to define sex. The man had sex. Everything that they say about what he did is true. It's just a bunch of lawyers trying to play games with the English language. I don't understand at all what's going on here, how an intelligent person like you or people of your age group can stay with a man like this who's double-crossed labor. He got our vote. We voted for him. He turns around, he signs NAFTA, which is going to put us down the tubes. We're losing jobs like crazy in this country. And in 25 years, my grandchildren, if they can't go to college and become some kind of a scientist or something, they won't be able to get a job. We don't have anything left in this country.
Thanks, Cole.
Everything this man has done has been to put this country down.
Thanks for the caller from Long Island, New York.
Well, you know, one of the comments he made was how the press is trying to split hairs on what sex is. The press isn't doing anything but reporting the spin of the Clinton office in this case. It's not the press that's doing it. I mean, the press is covering the story, obviously, but it isn't coming up with these, I agree, with these harebrained explanations of what sex is and what it isn't. So
Let me go back to the New York Times story again. This is the front page, which outlines in great detail what is sex according to what the lawyers have defined. But there's also a quote from Ann Lewis, who is the White House communications director. On January 25th, she appeared on the Fox News program. Quote, sex is sex, maybe only in Washington is this considered something we ought to spend a lot of time on. But no, a sexual relationship means what it says, and that includes sex. The story goes on to say, in Mr. Clinton's practice sessions, his advisors and his lawyers are questioning him and designing answers that allow him to acknowledge a relationship with Ms. Lewinsky without going into any graphic detail.
that's a big difference between saying I never had sexual relations with a woman and now saying, well, we had a limited sexual relationship. What did Nixon call that, the limited hangout route during Watergate?
Murfreesboro, Tennessee, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Mr. Webb, I'm curious if you're familiar with a book called Spite House, S-P-I-T-E, by Monica Stevenson. A friend of mine, she wrote the book about a friend of mine and Bobby Garwood, one of the only, I think, servicemen who was actually convicted of defecting during the Vietnam War. And one of the things, in one of the chapters they discuss in there was related to the use, or let's say the service going after defectors, not necessarily the use of nerve gas, but certainly in a vicious way to take care of them without due process. And of course, all of us know that sometimes under UCMJ, that due process is often set aside. I mean, it's a way that the service deals with things. So I'm just curious if you're familiar with that book at all.
Yeah, I have not read it, but I'm familiar with the book you're talking about. And I believe Garwood was on a national radio program the other day talking about what had happened to him. And I did not hear the show, but it was described to me that the other guest on the show was a military officer who had been sent to kill him. So, you know, what you're saying is not outside of the realm of possibility. I mean, defectors were treated very badly. And you know, if he was an actual defector, I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't be too sorry about that.
Another email, Mr. Webb earlier pointed out that the media loves covering an easy, sexy story ad nauseum. Sad but true, our media now mirrors the ugly Fleet Street type of yellow journalism from jolly old England. I find it disturbing that a special prosecutor has been questioning American citizens concerning the sex life of our president. Welcome to the age of the sex police. It has only just begun. Many others on Capitol Hill have skeletons in their closets. Such fodder for the American mind. We get a call from Flagler Beach, Florida. Good morning on our liberal line.
Good morning. Mr. Webb, you were saying that you like to write some books. I have a suggestion you might want to consider. I was paying attention for a while about how many military aircraft were going down. If you were to check the last 3 years alone, you'll be astounded and flabbergasted at the amount of airplanes throughout the world, United States military airplanes, helicopters, that have crashed. There are, I got up to 65, just with my narrow way of finding out. I think you're going to find billions and billions of dollars and hundreds of pilots, and it's not being, nobody's checking on this. You can also check in that book, if you were interested in writing the book, about how the industry, private industry, is stealing away our talented pilots. I have a friend who has 2 sons who were jet pilots, and they were on aircraft carrier Navy pilots, and they went to Iraq, and they became, what do you call them, experimental training. And they're astronauts right now. They're twin brothers, and they're both astronauts. But they were offered a fortune by private industry, and it cost $1 million each to train these guys. But the thing I think should be looked into is why and how many of these aircraft, military aircraft, are crashing. Just a suggestion. You might want to consider that. Bye-bye.
I think actually a reporter a couple of years ago won a Pulitzer Prize for a story, and I think it was military helicopters, if I'm not mistaken, how often they were crashing. So, I mean, you've got a point.
Florida City, Florida, on our moderate line. Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, I was a smuggler out of Miami from 1967 to 1983.
What did you smuggle?
I smuggled pot out of Colombia and Jamaica.
And why did you do it?
Well, because it made a lot of money.
How much did you make?
For the money, of course, and the action and the fun. But anyway,
hold on. How did you do it? Obviously, you flew, but
first we used to use sailboats in the early '60s, and then we switched over to for freighters and stuff till about the early '70s.
Oh, so you didn't fly?
Huh?
You didn't fly. You used a boat.
Then we switched over to airplanes, and we used airplanes. I used airplanes up until about ¡83 when I was captured.
How much money did you make?
Huh?
How much money did you make?
Oh, I don't know. We made a few millions of it.
And what are you doing now?
Ben Kramer was the last people I was involved in. That was one of the biggest seizures in the history of this country. But anyway, let's talk about the CIA.
Well, one last question, and then I'll let you. What are you doing today?
Oh, I'm retired.
Retired from drug smuggling.
I did 10 years of probation and time, and it was all right. But anyhow, it was very interesting. But anyhow, because I have connections with Nicaragua, because my father was part of the landing crew that captured and executed the Santino brothers, that they named the Sandinistas after. But anyhow, what I want to talk about is the CIA connection with drugs. See, my competitor were the Cubans, and the Cuban connections with the CIA are legendary.
Right.
And I was wondering if he had any story about. Well, right now they're about ready to turn over Homestead Air Force Base to this group of people I used to be my competitors with, Latin Builders Association, the Cuban organization. But anyhow, I was kind of curious about. In 1988, I lost a D-18 on a one-way trip to Costa Rica to haul, canvas and beads and stuff for them, and I never got the plane back. It just kind of went down there, and I believe they probably loaded it with dope and took it to California. The next time I saw it was Miami Vice. It was out there flying on the TV program. But anyhow, I was kind of curious if you ever found out and knew anything about any connection between the Cubans and the CIA with drugs, because I thought that was a pretty big story. And the head godfather, Jorge Mascanosa, just died.
We'll get a response. Thank you, caller from Florida City.
There was a lot of questions. I'll try to remember them all. Yeah, there was a very heavy Cuban presence in the Contra organizations down in Costa Rica that were involved in drug smuggling. There was actually a company called Frigoríficos de Punta Arenas that was based in Costa Rica. It was a shrimp importing company that was owned by Cuban-American drug smugglers, and they had a State Department contract to haul supplies to the Contras. So you're right. I mean, there was a very heavy Cuban presence down there, and I'm trying to remember some of the other questions he had about...
Well, the caller's not with us now, but I was intrigued by his own background and wondering how many of those type of drug smugglers there are or were in the time that you did your research.
There were dozens of them. There were dozens of them. And you know, one of the things he mentioned about losing an aircraft, I interviewed a former CIA pilot in Florida named Ronald Lippert, who leased one of his aircraft to this Contra organization, and it wound up in Mexico being seized by the Mexican police with like 2,500 pounds of pot on it. So, I mean, it's a situation that happened time and time again during the Contra War.
Briefly, can you explain how it worked for a pilot like this or the operator of a boat to get the drugs from South or Central America and bring it back?
What they were doing in this one particular drug ring that's in the book was they were flying it up through from Colombia to Costa Rica or to El Salvador. It would be offloaded from smaller planes onto either military aircraft in San Salvador, or it would be flown up, and in that case they would be taken to this base outside of Fort Worth. At least that's what the evidence suggested. In other cases, they would load them on, like he said, Colombian freighters, and in the case of this drug ring, it was the Grand Colombiana line. And they would ply the waters off the coast of California and Oregon and Seattle and go into these ports and literally dump cocaine overboard, and frogmen would swim it ashore. And that gave one of the famous cases in California that I write about in the book is called the Frogman case, and it was the biggest drug seizure in California history. Dark
Alliance, the CIA, the Contras, and the crack cocaine explosion. By the way, there's also a foreword by a California Congresswoman, Maxine Waters. Why did she write the start of the book?
Well, because this impacted most heavily in her district in South Central Los Angeles, and she has been the leading congressional advocate for an official investigation. I mean, essentially right now we've had investigations done by the suspects, the CIA, the Justice Department, and she's pushing for a quote-unquote real investigation by an outside agency or an outside body.
A few more minutes with our guest. Louisville is next on our conservative line. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, gentlemen. I have 2 points I'd like to make with regards to the Clinton problems that are in the media right now. I've seen presidents since Harry Truman's day, all right? That makes me a little older than you two fellas. But I can tell you this, that this gentleman we have as president now is the most grossly immature man we've ever had in the office, and I think that is unquestionably so. Second, we hear a lot of people calling in and complaining about the partisanship of Mr. Starr. I'd like to remind everybody that there's a gentleman working with Mr. Starr by the name of Samuel Dash. And if I remember my history correctly, Samuel Dash was a Democratic counsel to Sam Ervin on the Watergate Committee, and he was instrumental in bringing Richard Nixon down. Now, if this is such a partisan investigation, why are most, well, not most of them, but why are some of the prosecutors Democrat, and why is Mr. Dash, in fact, working with Mr. Starr?
Thanks, caller. Gary Webb?
I don't know the answer to that, other than, you know, prosecutors are prosecutors. I don't think most of them, by and large, are particularly partisan, although there's a lot of evidence of partisanship by Ken Starr.